I do sort of classify myself as a bit of a megalithic maniac, having dragged my family around countless numbers of stone circles, sometimes kicking and screaming. But it's been a deep interest for me for a large chunk of my life. What I want to cover... is that nice and flashy? In the footsteps of the Dodman. The Dodman, if we can just have a look at it, apart from my name, is this works. I want to start to look at some of the concepts, the ideas of the surveying techniques in the Neolithic period, going slightly into the Bronze Age time as well. And here's a classic Dodman image, complete with staff and so forth. So I think it represents something of what I want to be covering anyway in this next talk. And I want to really begin by just looking at a discovery which I made more years ago than I care to remember almost. But I ought to just explain first that my background is sort of in town planning and architecture. And a very formative book of mine, which came to me in the early 70s, was John Michel's View Over Atlantis. And at the time I was living in the Cheltenham area, and being interested in maps, being interested in planning and all of these things, I got my maps out, and very soon they became totally obliterated with lines going in every direction. And, you know, this was great stuff, but I wondered where on earth it was getting me. And then I started to go around and visit some of these places. And that was also very important because I began to recognize that certain places had a quality of energy which was different than others. So this is a crossing point of ley lines, crossing point of alignments in the landscape. Some had some definitive quality which was different. So I would start to draw nice circles around these points. And very slowly a sort of pattern began to emerge. And as I said, at the time I was based in Cheltenham, so I was looking at areas going up into the Cotswolds, Breedon Hill, and so forth. And that eventually led on to the discovery of this. And as you can see really here, we're not dealing with a straight line, we're dealing with a circle. So how did this come about? Just to pick up one or 2 points on this circle. First of all, we've got Avebury, key one here, another key point here called the Giant's Grave, but a number of sites, both relatively modern, if we're talking about churches, dated to 1100 or thereabouts, but also long barrows going back to probably 3,500 BC. Big time span. But this is part of what Watkins was sort of incorporating in his idea of ley lines and alignments. So in respect of this particular circle, one day I was looking at a map of Avebury, which is down here, and I was then looking at some church sites above it. So I'd get out my ruler, try to draw nice straight lines between them, couldn't get anywhere, and the more I looked at it, the more I began to think, you know, that's curious, it looks as though it might be on the arc of a circle. And at the time, I'd sort of, in working through some of my discoveries, realized that there was a unit of measure of about 6 miles, which seemed to occur with some frequency. So I got a sheet of tracing paper, drew the circle on the tracing paper, and plonked it down on the map. And what then emerged, if it goes on, yes, all right, here we are, it's just highlighting some of these sites here, was this circle. Not quite used to using this. Let's go back. Right, so we have the circle. Now, what can we say about this circle? I mean, first of all, I was amazed that here was represented in the landscape what appeared to be a circle, which conformed with all of the sort of bits which I would normally expect to find in a standard ley line. Its circumference is about just over 37 miles, and I guess me having a name like Furlong is very good and very relevant to doing this sort of work. We have the radius fraction under 6 miles, which we talked about, And there's 15 points on this circumference, 15, which is quite a lot. And it gives a 1 point about every 2.5 miles. This will become a little bit more relevant. So I puzzled about this for some time, wondering, of course, and I think this is always very important in this area, is it just a chance phenomena? Is there something else going on here? What indeed could be being presented from this? So if we go to Mr. Watkins here and his wonderfully influential book in the mid-1920s, The Old Straight Track, the area which I live at the moment is up in the Malvern Hills here, and this is one of his accepted ley lines, or the lines he talked about. It goes from a cave up here called Clusser's Cave, picks up a number of church sites, goes past a hill fort, onto a wonderful Cistercian abbey called Abbey Dore. What can we say about the facts of this line? Well, there's about 24 miles in distance. You can't see all of that space. You have to go from hilltop to hilltop to see it. But we've got 1 point average every 4 miles. Now, if we took our circle in the landscape and sort of slightly shortened it down to this 24 miles, what we would find is we were talking about a site here with, sorry again about this, a site every 9 or 10 points on that line. From all of the sort of statistical research which has gone on, when you start to get more than 6 points on a distance of that, it begins to be accepted that this is possibly deliberate, possibly, because of chance occurrence. Anything lower than 6 points, it's probably chance. So we have something here which clearly seems to suggest it could be deliberate. Now, you can imagine my excitement. Oh, new discovery at this. So I got to get out my tracing paper, go around other bits of map. First of all, looking at the maps at the time, and of course these were the old 1 inch to the mile maps, not the modern 1/50,000 scale now. So I played around with this for a bit, and eventually another circle emerged. So now we're talking about not just one circle, but 2 circles, exactly the same radius. This time, not quite so many points on it, but still picking up a mixture of old church sites, and these church sites, as I say, date to 11th, 1200s, but a number of more recent archaeological sites as well. Older archaeological sites. And also, when you go around these church sites, what's interesting, you find odd things like old stones built into the base of the church, which reinforces one of Watkins' concepts of these churches originally being built on older sacred sites. So here's another church. So what are the statistics we've got with this? So the Marlborough Downs West Circle, same size, same radius, 12 points on the circumference, 1 point every 3.12 miles, and this would, in effect, with our Abbey Dore alignment, mean that we were talking about 7 or 8 points. So again, in the upper end of the statistics. So where do we go here? What's the relationship between these 2 sites? Well, here we are, 2 interlocking circles. And I thought initially, well, this is wonderful, except that there's a slight problem. I would have loved it to have been a vesica. And try as I might, I kept moving it. Could I stretch it? Could I not? But no. There it was, stuck with the 2 centres way inside what I would expect from a vesica. So I had to puzzle about this for some time. But what's the relationship of these circles? Here we are, we've got the 2 points. And then when I started to apply 1 or 2 other things to the map, what I discovered was John Michel's wonderful Michael line, which runs up, as we know, through Glastonbury Tor, just close to here, going through Avebury. And as you can see from here, the line is running parallel to our centres. So again, this starts to be intriguing. It starts to make me think there has to be a relationship between these 2 areas. And if we mark on another site, which we've talked about a lot, Avebury, there it is, it sits neatly on the circumference of the circle. And on the other side, we've got Ogbourne St George. So a picture slowly started to build up. And I'm presenting this to you in a fairly quick way, but as you can imagine, from my point of view, this was me working at it, thinking about it, meditating on it, trying to understand what could be going on here. And for quite a long period of time, I could not get any further than this. I ought to just say something first of all about the Michael alignment, and I'm going to pick up one or two of these things again. Here it all is, running across the country, picking up some key sites. I visited most of these places at different times. There we can see Avebury, a few other places, Glastonbury, Bury St Edmunds, key points in the landscape. So a very evidential line. So here we are, back with our 2 points. We can draw a nice line up the centre, link the two together, and then I started to think about the geometry of all of this. And an idea came that maybe we should start to create an equilateral triangle between these. I would add that at these centre points, there's nothing there. Very sad. No, I would love to have been a nice monument or so forth. Unfortunately, they're both areas which, as people know this Avebury area, will know that it's been quite heavily sort of affected by farming and so forth. On this particular site, it's very close to an old railway line. Here, interestingly, in the landscape, not too far from the centre, there's a whole coppice of wood, and in there's some large sarsen stones. But there's nothing at the actual central point. So I create my equilateral triangle, and then something says you ought to extend that through to the touching points. Something suddenly started to come out. And of course, I got out my protractor. Bearing in mind, when I started all this thing, I was working with slide rules. Nothing like computers or anything like that. And that probably dates me quite a lot. And I can remember the time when the pocket calculator came along and I was playing around with that. It was fantastic. And of course, the computers. I sometimes say quite flippantly, when I turn my computer on in the morning, I bow down in front of it and say, "A wonderful computer," because it has opened up so much, so many fantastic things in the discovery. So what I discovered was that this triangle looked as though it was about the angular slope of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And of course, because we know the Ordnance Survey grid reference points, it's quite easy to apply some geometry to all this with one's pocket calculator and so forth to actually calculate out and show, yes, that angular slope is very close to the geometry of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. So what about the Great Pyramid of Egypt? Well, I've taken people onto the Giza Plateau on many, many occasions. It's an incredible monument. Egypt's an amazing place. But what could be the connection between Egypt and Britain? Huge difference. And here we have a cross-section of the pyramid, which shows what makes this pyramid quite unique is that we have chambers fairly high up within the body of the pyramid itself. In fact, out of a reference point, if we imagine there's these units is 7 units high, the Queen's chamber is about 1 unit and the King's chamber is about 2 units. So it's 2/7 of the way up the pyramid. So let's go back to our twin circles. So I then took a wonderful section of the Great Pyramid of Egypt, lay it on the map, and what we discovered here, set out very neatly, is the pyramid, but with the St. Michael line going through here, and look where it goes, right through the position of where the King's chamber would be on the ground. Again, bizarre. You know, I have to keep asking myself, is this me projecting ideas onto the landscape? And I think we always need to be open to that, because in a psychological level, there's a wonderful quote which says, we see things not as they are, but as we are. So was it me so keen to see pyramids on here that this is what I was deliberately creating? But if you look here at this point, very beautifully named Temple Farm, after the Knights Templars. who owned the chunk of land in there, we find that there's the alignment of the Grand Gallery goes to the points of where one of our circles is, suggesting a similar concept of underlining pattern. There's a lot of other things I could say about all of this, but that was the basic discovery. Now, when you've got two circles together, we can say, okay, probably likely to be supporting to be true, but in the researches which I've done, some other circles have come to light, but this is one particularly I want to just mention here, is another circle in the Cotswold area here. And we can see some key points on here, the rollright stones, some church points around here. And if we actually have a look at some of this, here's the circle in the landscape. There's the rollright stones highlighted. This line here is almost exactly east-west. So this is an equinoctial line. But as you see, there's not so many sites on this circle. Except one thing that led me to discover it was a road which runs all along the circumference for quite a large chunk of this circle. So that was the thing which made it stand out, and that was the thing which made me aware of this circle. So a few statistics here. Again, what we've got, exactly the same circumference, radius just under 6 miles, 11 points, just one less than the western circle on the Moor Bounds. So we've got, compared with the Abbey-Dore line, we would have 7 points. Again, statistically more than you would expect to find. So the evidence starts to occur that somewhere in the landscapes of Britain, or in these places in the landscapes of Britain, these circles have been deliberately created. And of course this raises some very important questions about how this could have been done. The other interesting enigma, which I'm sure some of you would love to pick up on, is that if we take the size of the circle and multiply it by this magic number 666, you actually get the circumference of the Earth at the equator. So there's a suggestion that these circles were deliberately created in relationship to the Earth's proportions. And this again raises a big question. How did they know the size of the Earth? When was these circles possibly created, if they were created? And just again to put this into context, I know John Michel in his book talks a lot about the significance of 666 and what that actually might mean. But it's not the only time that it occurs in the Bible, in that famous quote in Revelations. There's a wonderful quote in Kings which says something to the effect, now all of the talents of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. Solomon is, of course, an anagram for sun and moon. Sol, moon, is sun and moon. It's all to do with ancient cosmology, measurements, and so forth. And of course, for me to find myself in here as well, when I measured the circumference in furlongs, what did I find? That there was a, whoops, I've gone back. I keep doing this, apologies about this. If I measured myself in here, there's 300 furlongs in the circumference of the circle. Indeed, the furlong measure would appear to be relating to the Earth's proportions. So, a number of things which came out of all of this. I also ought to say something about the another major alignment, because again, from a point of view, we can always present one example of a case, but if we can start to present more, then that starts to become more evidential. So I just thought I'd put in here another major alignment, which I think is relevant. It's been sort of touched on over this weekend. And I call this the Canterbury line. It runs from Canterbury Cathedral. It passes very neatly through London. It goes through a number of key sites, Rochester, Greenwich. It comes on to Gloucester Cathedral and on to this site, Abbey-Dore, that we talked about earlier. And if you look at London place there, it runs very neatly through London. In fact, when you plot this line out, it goes from Canterbury, not quite through the Houses of Parliament, more through Downing Street. So I can imagine Gordon Brown sat there in his offices and the Archbishop is sending out his prayers and it's going straight up along the line, causing him to become incredibly together and wise and everything else. Is there a joke in there somewhere? Anyway, there is evidence, and one could go on, and I have done in all of this, just looking at possible patterns which link up lots of key sites in the landscape. And they conform to the similar types of statistics that one could see represented in the Michael line. Again, I have to come back saying, am I projecting this onto the landscape? But from my perspective, it's beginning to suggest to me some form of coherent planning at quite a large level in relationship to the linking of these sites together. We can ask why, but at this stage, let's just see from what's there. So, the problems and challenges of all of this. First of all, as I've said, could these just be coincidence? Or is there some suggestion that these patterns here have been deliberate? Secondly, in us analysing them, are the criteria valid? We have an incredible cultural span between the churches to the Neolithic sites. And this is one of the problems which archaeologists find very hard to relate to. Bearing in mind, if we're talking about going back into the Neolithic period, we're talking about going back 5,500 years. So there's like a 4,000-year gap between the churches and the original long-barrow sites. But I think this can be explained through different ways, and I think there is a coherence in the link. One, of course, the sanctity, the original concept of the sanctity of the sites. And the other thing, of course, is beginning to ask the question, how could people in the Neolithic times have created one, long-distance alignment, two, to set out in the landscape a circular pattern? After all, setting out alignments is dead easy, certainly if you're going over fairly short distances. One of my hobbies, although I don't do it quite so often now, is subaquea diving. And when I first used to go out on dives, we'd be out on the boat, going out to find some wreck in the sea, well, of course, no physical sights to see, but what you have to do is work on something called transits. You'd look to the horizon, and you would look to see points a bit closer, and when you were in line with it, you knew you were on the wreck. And we could locate wrecks within 50 feet by simply watching transits over 5 or 6 mile distances. So it's a very, very accurate way of doing it. But circles are different, and obviously when you start to magnify this up, to think about creating a long-distance alignment, the problems become that slight errors begin to get magnified. So there's real problems here. And of course the other thing is, how could anyone in that time have worked out or been able to understand the Earth's proportions? So first of all, let's just have a look at this from the point of view of how I believe, quite simply, people in the past were able to create such alignments. And it's already been sort of alluded to over this, over the talks which we've had in this wonderful weekend. Here we are, here's the alignment. It's actually on an azimuth bearing of about 242 degrees. And one of the suggestions which had been given to me when I was starting to look at all of this, that it was been aligned to the May Day sunrise. And I thought about this, of course. The sun is a sort of obvious way that we can create a marker, watching the sunrise at different times. But of course, as you go through the year, particularly when we get close to the equinoxes, the sun's coming up at very different positions over each day. It moves in quite large amounts. So to try to create a long-distance alignment seemed to me to be improbable that this was linked in any way to the sun. I think it's much more likely to have been linked to the stars. And as you'll actually see here in relationship to this, to Orion, and I think one of the belt stars of Orion. And it was interesting for me listening to Nicholas talking about the significance of Orion in all of this. Because if we look at here, down here, if you can see it, one of the problems you have about stars is something called extinction. As the stars get closer to the horizon, they disappear. But it wouldn't be too difficult to set up some sight line and just watch the star as it goes over a marker point or a rod, and then you can fix a point. And then from that fixed point, it can take you onto the next hill, and onto the next hill. And by simply following the stars in this way, and I've started to look at all sorts of different alignments, it's very, very easy to begin to set up and create long-distance alignments by simply watching what's going on in the heavens and sighting onto a particular star, of which Orion's belt and Sirius were important not only I think in Britain, but also in Egypt as well. So another sort of link in all of this. And again, just to reinforce the fact that this wasn't just a one-off circumstances. When Tony was talking about the alignments in London, some of the significances here, here's one which she mentioned, Arnold Circus, you can see up here. This key point goes through the Strand, comes down to St James's Palace. This again was one of Watkins's lines. But lo and behold, that too is at 242 degrees. So from my point of view, if it was set up as an alignment, it was set up to the alignment to Orion's belt. Easy to do. So I don't think intrinsically there's a problem about creating long-distance alignments. I think this can easily be done within the landscape with the technology and understanding that our Neolithic ancestors would have had. I want to now just have a quick look at another problem. And this is all to do really with the challenge which archaeologists have thrown at all of this by saying all the time you're dealing with monuments at such a wide span. So one of the things I thought to do was to actually look at the Long Barrows in the Marlborough Downs area. And some very, very interesting things came out. Now, the Long Barrow period is a fairly narrow time when they were creating these long rectilinear mounds. I'm sure some of you have been to West Kennet, which is one of the most famous, and we can see West Kennet here, and wondered at their shape. Now, what happened from a chronological point of view is that the Long Barrow period was somewhere from about, say, 2600 BC to probably just around about 3000 BC. Maybe 100 years or so either side of that, because radiocarbon dating is not completely precise. But what happened is the culture in this country suddenly stopped building long barrows and started to build circles. That was a big transition. And the greatest circles in this country, at Stonehenge and at Avebury and so forth, Castle Rig, all started around about 3000 BC. A little bit earlier, maybe 100 years or so, but that was the start phase. So something quite dramatic occurred culturally here. But here we have set out in the landscape of the Marlborough Downs a triangle. And we can see it evidenced here with three long barrows. We've got the West Kennet Barrow, I already mentioned, Beckhampton Road Barrow, sadly now being ploughed out, but there's very good evidence for it being there, and a Kitchen Barrow, which is high up on the hill. Indeed, this is some other long barrow alignments here, but just let's focus on this one at the moment. So what comes to light in relationship to this as a barrow? So on the Marlborough Downs, built probably circa 3500 BC. Now, this distance here is about 3.77 kilometers. See, I moved on to kilometers. My oldest son keeps badgering me, saying, you've got to get into meters and so forth. No one understands furlongs and miles anymore. So I've sort of partly gone along with him on this. But what's so stunning about this is almost exactly east-west. The only difference is about 9 minutes of arc. 9 minutes of arc. They rave over the accuracy of the Great Pyramid of Egypt, over 700 or so feet. But here we are talking about 3 kilometers, accurate to within 9 minutes of arc, which is extraordinarily accurate. And this distance is, this alignment is almost exactly north-south. Well, a long barrow can be up to 100 yards long, 100 meters long. So I can slightly move the key point where I measure from, but it again, I would say, is a right-angled triangle set out in the landscape. And what's interesting about this particular triangle is that if we take the ratio of it all, then it absolutely conforms to the same geometry as we find in the Great Pyramid of Egypt. The same ratio of height to base. So here we are talking about, in the landscape of Britain, set out with these three monuments, again to the cardinal points, and again at the same ratios we would find in the Great Pyramid of Egypt, at a time of around about 3,500 BC, which is 1,000 years prior to the building of the Great Pyramid of Egypt, if you accept the orthodox view that they were built around about 2,500 BC. So, more evidence to support this. But what's so special about this particular triangle? Why could it have been important in Neolithic times? I think this then again raises some very interesting concepts and ideas to get into the mind of why this would have occurred. Here we have it. Now what's interesting in this, it's on a ratio of 14 units to 11 units. 14 to 11, keep thinking, 14 to 11. So if our height is 14 units and our base is 11 units, what we find is, very, very neatly, is the distance around this circle. If I was to imagine this was the diameter of a circle, the distance around this circle exactly equals the distance round a square. So it's a very, very simple way of actually working out the distances, the circumferences of circles. So you can begin to see why it could have a value to a simple, or people, not necessarily simple, but a people who were interested in ratios and proportions. So, ratio of 14 to 11. Now, something else quite amazing begins to occur in all of this. And I've put this up here. First of all, just to make this clear, we're basing this on pi being 22 over 7. And so the distance around the circle is 22 over 7 times 14. So pi d, pi diameter, gives 44. And if this is 11, 4 11s are 44. So the distance round is the same, 44 units. Doesn't matter what units you use at this stage. But something quite curious occurs in all of this, is that there's a relationship between the megalithic yard and imperial yard. Again, we're getting into nice measurements. And this ratio is a ratio of 11 to 10. So I thought about this and thought, well, of course, if that's 11 megalithic yards, it had to be 10 imperial yards. And then I thought, wait a minute, that's 30 feet, 360 inches, and I began to think then, 360, what's this telling me? Well, what you actually begin to think of immediately is 360 degrees, the number of degrees in a circle. And there's another interesting link between Britain and Egypt in relationship to this, is that in Egypt they have the royal cubit, and in the royal cubit they have 7 hands. So the hand measure is part of their measuring system. And the hand is about 4 inches. So what you find is that in this side of here we've got actually 90 hands, and it's the same as a quadrant of the circle. And a quadrant of a circle we know is 90 degrees. So in a very simple way, perhaps the people in the past were able to create a form of theodolite for measuring accurately. And I've done this. I've set this up, and you can measure wonderfully accurate measurements down to 1/8 of a degree. So when you're talking about trying to watch precession over a period of a lifetime, you could begin to mark this out. And how could such a theodolite work? Well, in a funny sort of way, Stonehenge is almost a replica of it. Because if we think of the circle on the top, and you can imagine you could sight on here, you could actually begin to create and connect points across the top to measure very accurately. So we now come on to begin to think about how could one set out a circle? Again, as I've talked about, you would think at one level it would be this would almost be impossible to do. And I used to think initially, maybe it's a question of people going along with their dowsing rods, walking across here, suddenly the rods cross, and you think, here we got a nice key major point. So we'll put our marker down. But one of the curious things about these circles, if you take this particular circle and plant it down over the circle adjoining it and turn it through exactly 45 degrees, a number of the key points actually begin to link up and measure up, which suggests to me that these people were actually measuring out and setting these patterns out in the landscape. Well, of course, a circle is made up of a series of points. There's no one there with a long piece of string who's gone and stood at the center and said, okay, let's try and create this out. It's quite difficult to see across the circle. Indeed, if you stand here at the East Kennet Long Barrow, you can just about make out the line of part of it on this side. So these are major patterns in the landscape. But in thinking about it, it seems to me that the most likely thing they did was to work with a series of triangulations, sort of the way which we do surveying today, but again working with fairly simple ratios and numbers, so that by setting out a series of these particular triangles, they could in fact fix points within the landscape. But in order to do this, you would have to have a model, of course. You can't just do it off the top of your head. There would require a lot of planning in relationship to this. So let's just have a look at another circle here. What are the ratios that this one's based upon? Well, if we actually look at it, we've got 90 degree, 60, 30. Again, starting to recognize that you could very simply, by working with different ratios, begin to set out some of these patterns in the landscape. Now, one of the other things which, as we remembered, sat on the edge of that vast circle was the rollright stones. And I have a theory that the rollright stones is actually our template for setting out the landscape circle. Because if you begin to sorry about this. If I get this, no, go back. Yeah. If we get this wonderful circle here and begin to fix where some of these points are, by working with certain ratios, of which I started to work out here, you begin to get very accurate degree measures. And this is one of the things which I think the Neolithic people were into working with, is ratios and numbers. I used to remember going back again going back a few years now, it's disappeared out of this country, but going up hills, you know, you'd be driving along the car, you come to the hill, it'd say this is a 1 in 6 hill, or a 1 in 8 hill, or a 1 in 7 hill. Now they talk about percentages, and I don't really understand percentages, but I do understand the idea of 1 and 6. It gives a sort of slope. And this is what I think our Neolithic ancestors were doing, or those who started to create and set out these patterns were doing. That they use certain ratios, like 14 to 11, as you see 19 to 11 creates an angle of 30 degrees. Very easy to begin to do all this and set this out in the landscape. And just I should have said in relationship to the timing of that Michael line, if we take Mintaka as being the key point when that alignment was set up, we're talking about somewhere around about 2800 BC, which is contemporary with a lot of all of this sort of megalithic survey work. Here's a picture of the rollright stones, and when I was at the Lay Hunters Moot last weekend, we actually visited and had a chance to experience something of these places. So, next problem, how could people work out latitudes? Well, we already had an idea, it was talked about, working with the sun. It's very easy, measuring shadows. What you find is, of course, is the midwinter sun casts a very long shadow. And we can see that measured here. If you're looking at an equinoctial sun or a midsummer sun, the shadow becomes much shorter. So as long as I know my east, north-south direction, I could actually measure the shadows of the day and know where we are in relationship to a calendar. One could also mark special festival days. Now, the equinoctial sun, this is the key one. So I've got to know the east-west direction. I need to know exactly when the equinox is going to occur. It's this sun which gives me my latitude. So as long as I know exactly where the equinox is, it doesn't matter where I am, I can begin to work out exactly what latitude is. And I think the idea of being able to do this on a more regular basis, as for the sea travellers on one of the talks which we had, it may be they had a template of actually adjusting these things. But the equinox is the one which gives you your latitude, and it's not difficult to do. You can easily calculate out this angle or the ratio, which will give you where you are on the planet. And it just so happens, again, close to Avebury, there's a wonderful monument called the Sanctuary. Sadly, most of it has been dug up and all the stones there, but they are marked here. And this is actually a very complex pattern, as you can begin to see here, with these rings made up of post holes, stones, and so forth. If we just take here on the, if I mark these out, if we take going on the western side and the eastern side, we've got 21 stones on each side. But if we go north-south, we've got 20 stones on the top and 22 stones on the bottom. 10 to 11 ratio. And there's a series of other quite interesting coincidences. We've got 7 stones round here, 8 stones round here, 9 round here, 10 round here. I think this was set up as a wonderful way of calculating out some of these patterns which are set out in the landscape. And of course, a post in the middle here, watching what was going on with the sun at noon would cast a shadow, and depending on how long that shadow was, if it reached the edge of the circumference, you would know it was midwinter, and as it slowly shortened itself back, you could plot exactly where you are in the seasons. Very, very easy to do, doing it with fairly simple basic equipment. Just to come back to Avebury and look at Avebury again from a geometric point of view. One of the things which has been talked about is the question, of course, about how our Neolithic people could have set out circles. And the idea with Avebury, which archaeologists sometimes throw out, is, oh, well, they were never very good at creating a circle. And as you can see here, if this is the real circle, then they were quite way out at these points. But the fact that they could create all of these stones here beautifully along the circumference of the circle for nearly a whole quadrant suggests to me that they were quite capable of creating circles. And if they chose to change some of these lines, they were doing it for some deliberate purposes. And here's some of the geometric lines we can begin to project onto Avebury. And I was very interested in what Nicholas was saying about the connection with the stars and the way in which this could be used again as another level of sanctuary, combining many functions, and not least of which was understanding our relationship to or early man's relationship to the stars. And one of the obvious bits in relationship to all of this is that there was a big stone here called the obelisk, and it's fairly obvious when you look at this that the alignment here is on an exact east-west line. So my guess is that, again, this was a very good way of being able to know exactly when the equinoxes were, because the sun coming up would hit the obelisk and cast a long shadow. And it's very interesting, the use of shadows and light. Going back a few years now, I happen to be up at a stone circle in Ireland, southern Ireland, called the Drombeg Circle. And we happened to arrive at this Drombeg Circle round about the equinox, so it was about 21st of September, and it was getting fairly close to sunset. So I said to the group which I was with, let's just sit here and see what happens to the shadows in relationship to this circle. And as we watched, as the sun going down, so the shadows started to lengthen, and a shadow from one of the stones went slowly across the whole of the circle and eventually just touched the bottom of a stone opposite before the sun disappeared. And at the time, they were making big stress in this circle that this was aligned to the midwinter sunset. But I actually think if we'd bothered people would have bothered to go to these places and watch what happened at the sun at key points of the year, they would have found much, much more evidence would have come to light about the significance of the stones, the size of the stones, the shadows they cast in relationship to giving an understanding to their place in the cosmos. So I actually thought I'd finish all of this by just taking a little jump into another whole culture, and I will only be a few more minutes because I promised to finish about 1:45, to just go and have a look at a discovery which we made last year at Hatshepsut's temple in Egypt. This is dated to about 1450 BC. And there we went on a very special day of the year, the midwinter solstice, up to the temple, managed to get special permission to get into it, and you can see here a few of the people coming with us. And as we were looking down the avenue of Hatshepsut's temple, you can see these hot air balloons slowly begin to rise up, and I think, oh my God, I hope they're not going to upset our seeing what we had come to see. And here's a view from inside the inner chamber of the temple. Normally can't get into this area for general public, but we managed to get permission to do it. Just rather curiously here, we've got one or two of these enigmatic balls of light which sometimes come into these sorts of pictures. So here we were waiting. And what were we waiting for? Looking out to the horizon. And then, at the wonderful moment of time, up came the sun. Absolutely in line with the inner doorway of the temple. So Hatshepsut's temple is aligned to the midwinter sunrise. And here again we've got an incredible interest in the culture, because a lot more evidence now is coming out into Egypt. And this is one of the things about textual information, which is important, is that many of the major temples of Egypt are aligned to the midwinter sunrise. It's not just the Karnak temple. Here is a beautiful, magnificent temple at Hatshepsut's temple, which too is aligned to the midwinter sunrise. And originally, instead of a statue of an individual stood here, there would have been a wonderful statue of Amun-Ra, perhaps sat or stood, and the midwinter sun would have cast this wonderful red light, golden light, onto the statue at this key point of the year. So there is a sense of a continuity, a concept of idea. One of the problems about Egypt is that there's very little textual information to support this. This is why when we went to that site, we were the only people there. Egyptologists were not there because none of the texts that actually said to them, go to Hatshepsut's temple and you will see this midwinter sunrise. So textual information doesn't give us all the answers. It only gives us some, and this is the areas, as far as Egypt is concerned, which the archaeologists sometimes, or the Egyptologists, sometimes get stuck. They all the time want textual support for what's going on. And just to show that this is not the only solstitial alignment in the Karnak area. In fact, a number of the temples in the Karnak area are aligned to the midwinter sunrise. Here is Karnak temple itself, and as you can see, the sun is coming up beautifully, right in line with the main axis of the temple. So from my point of view, one of the things which I have to ask myself in relationship to all of this is, if we look at Britain, we have a whole concept of an idea of landscape planning, setting out in the landscape certain patterns. Why would people do this? I cannot believe that this is done simply for egotistical purposes. There had to be something deeply spiritual and meaningful in relationship to these places. It's very interesting if we go back to the Avebury area. This is an area which is extensively represented every year with the crop circles coming out. But I happen to believe that there was a way of encoding into the landscape spiritual concepts, spiritual energies. And this was done not just in places like Avebury, but extending out over the whole of that region. Indeed, maybe there's chunks of Britain which connect in with this, and perhaps as a concept we could extend it out into other areas of the world as well. I've just recently come back from Malta, and there's some amazing temple sites in there. So one has a whole sense of the sacred becoming part of the landscape and being recognized as part of the landscape. And it's certainly my belief that we need to begin to get back to that feeling of the sacredness within the land and honoring the land in the way that I think certainly took place many thousands of years ago. And just to finish, so this was the book which I wrote, which talked about the more technical aspects of the Marlborough Downs discoveries. And this is a book which I've done more recently, which is more looking at the more spiritual aspects of what could be there located within the landscape and hidden in the landscape. And I think now I think it's my time to finish. So I'd like to thank you all for being such a wonderfully attentive audience. And as I've said, I really appreciated being able to share some of this information with you. So thank you. One circle, but two circles. Exactly the same radius. This time, not quite so many points on it, but still picking up a mixture of old church sites. And these church sites, as I say, date to 11th, 1200s, but a number of more recent archaeological sites as well. Older archaeological sites. And also, when you go around these church sites, what's interesting, you find odd things like old stones built into the base of the church, which reinforces one of Watkins' concepts of these churches originally being built on older sacred sites. So here's another church. So what are the statistics we've got with this? So the Marlborough Downs West Circle, same size, same radius, 12 points on the circumference, 1 point every 3.12 miles, and this would, in effect, with our Abbey-Dore alignment, mean that we were talking about 7 or 8 points. So again, in the upper end of the statistics. So where do we go here? What's the relationship between these two sites? Well, here we are, two interlocking circles. And I thought initially, well, this is wonderful, except that there's a slight problem. I would have loved it to have been a vesica. And try as I might, I kept moving it. Could I stretch it? Could I not? But no. There it was stuck with the two centres way inside what I would expect from a vesica. So I had to puzzle about this for some time. But what's the relationship of these circles? Here we are. We've got the 2 points. I do sort of classify myself as a bit of a megalithic maniac, having dragged my family around countless numbers of stone circles, sometimes kicking and screaming. But it's been a deep interest for me for a large chunk of my life. What I want to cover, is that nice and flashy? In the footsteps of the Dodman. The Dodman, if we can just have a look at it, apart from my name, is, this works. I want to start to look at some of the concepts, the ideas of the surveying techniques in the Neolithic period, going slightly into the Bronze Age time as well. And here's a classic Dodman image, complete with staff and so forth. So I think it represents something of what I want to be covering anyway in this next talk. And I want to really begin by just looking at a discovery which I made more years ago than I care to remember almost. But I ought to just explain first that my background is sort of in town planning and architecture. And a very formative book of mine, which came to me in the early 70s, was John Michel's View Over Atlantis. And at the time I was living in the Cheltenham area, and being interested in maps, being interested in planning and all of these things, I got my maps out, and very soon they became totally obliterated with lines going in every direction. And, you know, this was great stuff, but I wondered where on earth it was getting me. And then I started to go around and visit where I live at the moment, is up in the Malvern Hills here, and this is one of his accepted ley lines, or on the lines he talked about. It goes from a cave up here called Clusser's Cave, picks up a number of church sites, goes past a hill fort, onto a wonderful Cistercian abbey called Abbey Dore. What can we say about the facts of this line? Well, there's about 24 miles in distance. You can't see all of that space. You have to go from hilltop to hilltop to see it. But we've got 1 point average every 4 miles. Now, if we took our circle in the landscape and sort of slightly shortened it down to this 24 miles, what we would find is we were talking about a site here with, sorry again about this, a site every 9 or 10 points on that line. From all of the sort of statistical research which has gone on, when you start to get more than 6 points on a distance of that, it begins to be accepted that this is possibly deliberate, possibly, because of chance occurrence. Anything lower than 6 points, it's probably chance. So we have something here which clearly seems to suggest it could be deliberate. Now, you know, you can imagine my excitement. Oh, new discovery at this. So I got to get out my tracing paper, go around other bits of map. First of all, looking at the maps at the time, and of course these were the old 1 inch to the mile maps, not the modern 1/50,000 scale now. So I played around with this for a bit, and eventually another circle emerged. So now we're talking about not just one visit, some of these places. And that was also very important because I began to recognize that certain places had a quality of energy which was different than others. So this is a crossing point of ley lines, crossing point of alignments in the landscape. Some had some definitive quality which was different. So I would start to draw nice circles around these points. And very slowly a sort of pattern began to emerge. And as I said, at the time I was based in Cheltenham, so I was looking at areas going up into the Cotswolds, Breedon Hill, and so forth. And that eventually led on to the discovery of this. And as you can see really here, we're not dealing with a straight line, we're dealing with a circle. So how did this come about? Just to pick up 1 or 2 points on this circle. First of all, we've got Avebury, key one here, another key point here called the Giant's Grave, but a number of sites, both relatively modern, if we're talking about churches, dated to 1100 or thereabouts, but also long barrows going back to probably 3,500 BC, big time span. But this is part of what Watkins was sort of incorporating in his idea of ley lines and alignments. So in respect of this particular circle, one day I was looking at a map of Avebury, which is down here, And I was then looking at some church sites above it. So I'd get out my ruler, try to draw nice straight lines between them. Couldn't get anywhere. And the more I looked at it, the more I began to think, that's curious. It looks as though it might be on the arc of a circle. And at the time, I'd sort of, in working through some of my discoveries, realized that there was a unit of measure of about 6 miles, which seemed to occur with some frequency. So I got a sheet of tracing paper, drew the circle on the tracing paper, and plonked it down on the map. And what then emerged, if it goes on, yes, all right, here we are. It's just highlighting some of these sites here, was this circle. Not quite used to using this. Let's go back. Right, so we have the circle. Now, what can we say about this circle? I mean, first of all, I was amazed that here was represented in the landscape what appeared to be a circle, which conformed with all of the sort of bits which I would normally expect to find in a standard ley line. Its circumference is about just over 37 miles, and I guess me having a name like Furlong is very good and very relevant to doing this sort of work. We have the radius fraction under 6 miles, which we talked about, and there's 15 points on this circumference, 15, which is quite a lot, and it gives a 1 point about every 2.5 miles. This will become a little bit more relevant. So I puzzled about this for some time, wondering, of course, and I think this is always very important in this area, is it just a chance phenomena? Is there something else going on here? What indeed could be being presented from this? So if we go to Mr. Watkins here and his wonderfully influential book in the mid-1920s, The Old Straight Track, the area